But surely the fish will come back again one day, won't they, Dad?
I don't think so. Extinction's dead, just like the dinosaurs.
See, that was what the world, the oceans be like in 2050. It's obviously a prediction. And we'll be looking at, in a moment, at some of the issues that might lead us to that state of affairs and what's necessary in order to avoid that. But before we start that, is there anything anyone likes to say about their reaction to those films?
Can I put a point though? Both those videos made the point that that the seas were going to be emptied by 2050, and if you look at fisheries that are being sustainably managed, that is increasing and increasing all the time. So isn't the picture actually that more and more fisheries are going towards sustainable, and even the picture in, say, the North Sea has improved from 2012 to maybe to now in terms of a lot of fish stocks. So isn't there a place that we just need to get better at managing the fish stocks and fishing them sustainably, rather than saying, no, we mustn't exploit the sea?
Yes, off you go.
The impacts, of course, we've had on the seas, what steps we put in place, or is it, instead of putting steps in place, would it literally be better just to stop all fishing commercially in the seas? Because what we're doing is we're damaging so far, and even when I'm watching that video, I'm thinking, what are we going to do about this? Because it's all well putting quotas on, but they're still going to be broken, animals are still, or fish are still going to be damaged, ecosystems are still being damaged. What is there we can do?
Okay. Does anyone else want to put in their thoughts at this point?
Yeah, I agree with that you sort of have to take into account economics as well. Like when you're thinking about quotas and how stopping fishing would affect the economies.
So the economic consequences of taking the action. Yeah.
And there's billions of people on the planet that rely on fish for their protein, so we have.
It's a vital food source, exactly.
But there are plenty of other sources of protein, tons. There are. It's well known and documented now that you don't need to eat fish for protein.
Yeah, but I mean, look at haddock. I mean, the 1880 stock size, 7% decline must be within this.
This is in your seminar notes.
Right? It must be within your
it's on our
error.
PowerPoint, I think it's slide 4. Actually.
Yeah. It must be within the realms of error, because estimating stocks in 1880 has got to be. I mean, you've got the link for your thing, but that's got to be within the realms of error. That would say that haddock has been probably pretty much stable from 1880 to 2010. I don't know how much haddock is eaten. That 7% is definite. Must be within your experimental error.
Yes, these are figures which compare the 1880 stock with the 2010 stock. They're taken from government figures, UK government's Centre for Environment and Aquaculture, Fisheries and Agricultural Science, CFAS. And there are obviously, as you point out, there's a fair degree of error in these things, but the important thing is to be able to see the trend that's going on.
But the trend in haddock is good, basically. That to me, that says there is no real change between 1880 and 2010.
In that stock, yes.
In that stock.
But what about the other stocks?
Well, but that's one point, but the point is in haddock, that's a sustainable fishery.
That is being fished.
Surely when the others go, you say inevitably will, then haddock's gone by default.
I mean, you would think it would, but if that's all gone down by that much, and haddock's remaining.
Because if you take everything else away and you just leave haddock don't last long.
But they've been taking.
I get your point,
looking
it's
at
not
that,
changed much.
Looking at that, if you look at those figures, there's a huge decline in other fish stocks, but haddock are remaining stable.
But then, if the other fish stock disappears...
But I mean, you're looking at that and you say that's almost disappeared.
Hmm?
That's saying that stocks in other species have almost disappeared.
Yeah, so when they do,
But-
ultimately, surely haddock ain't going to be there.
But
Inevitably,
that's
one
not
day
the
they'll be
trend.
gone.
But that's not the trend haddock's showing, is it? Haddock's showing that
Yeah.
it's okay.
At the moment.
It's stable with a huge decline.
Yeah, but that's stable currently.
Yeah.
When they go, it ain't no longer.
But I think
that's
also-
no longer the picture, is it? So
But
currently
you
it
would
might
surely,
be
if that was
won't
the
be.
case, you would expect, wouldn't you? You would expect that haddock would be reducing similarly in line with like herring
Yeah,
being
so-
snatched.
yeah, I get.
But I
that.
mean, also you're thinking
But
if you got rid of most of, I guess, the cod and stuff, they compete with herring and with haddock to some extent. So getting rid of other species, it doesn't make haddock an unsustainable fishery. Haddock is a sustainable fishery, and you should surely look at the reasons haddock is sustainable and try and bring that into your other fisheries, as opposed to saying stop fishing, because haddock is obviously a success story.
But also that data is making it real doom and gloom for things like mackerel and cod. But actually, stocks of mackerel in the North Atlantic are higher than ever at the moment. And so it's, and to say that they're, you know, only an 86% of what they should be in the North Sea 10 years ago is being a bit emotive about it in terms of picking a figure that perhaps is swaying it one way. Do you think?
Well,
And similarly,
the
cod.
question of
cod was
emotive.
blue tick last year,
Yeah,
didn't
the
it?
question of emotive, I'm trying to leave the emotive side out of it. I'm trying to look at things factual. This is, of course, just the North Sea, right? When you go to other seas, the English Channel, the Irish Sea, Bay of Biscay, Arctic Sea, and so forth, you'll have a different set of figures and circumstance. So this is just one place over one time. Now, the question I think you also need to ask yourself is what's caused that? Because if haddock is not to end up in the same state as cod and other stocks, what has got to happen to prevent that? Because if cod is overfished, as you can see it is, the pressure is going to be on the stocks which are still abundant to be fished, because as was made earlier on, there's an economic issue there, and if we take a wider look at the global picture, many communities around the world are based on fishing, particularly in coastal states. It's central to their economy, and these are a very important issue. So they can't readily give up fishing in the same way as our fishing communities and other in the European Union also argue that they don't want to be obliterated. You know, they don't want to disappear like the car industry did in this country, or whichever industry you refer to. They want to have a future. So we've got to look at the questions of how that future is actually sustainably managed. The one other point about these mackerel, which is arguably being more sustainably managed now, is what actually is the level of the stock. Because one of the issues that came up in the Common Fisheries Policy reform back in 2012 was the idea that you can fish sustainably to what is known as the maximum sustainable yield. So the scientists take a figure for the stock and say, right, you can take out of that stock X number of tons per year and leave sufficient breeding stock for that to regenerate to enable you to take another X quantity of tons the year after, maximum sustainable yield. And so they've been trying to set quotas based on this concept of a maximum sustainable yield. But there is one difficulty with that, apart from working out what a maximum sustainable yield is that when you start setting it for these stocks, these stocks that have been heavily overfished, the stock compared to historic terms is a fraction of what it is. Today is a fraction of what it was. So maximally sustainably fishing a very depressed level is virtually keeping that stock at that very depressed level. It's not actually allowing it to rebuild to its historic level, which would in fact, if it were to happen, produce a much more abundant fishery, both in terms economically and in terms of food. So maximum sustainable yield is a useful tool, but it's keeping the stocks at this very depressed level. And that's one of the weaknesses in the common fisheries policy reform. So although mackerel is coming back, for example, to be more abundant, it's still, in historic terms, extremely depressed. What are the factors, does anyone think, that has caused this situation to come about? Because fishermen have an eye to maintaining their future. Governments, pardon?
It's what the public wants to eat. Like, cod is always going to be the fish and chips. So it's going to be fished for more. And it's trying to get people's perception to go across to other whitefish. Like, if you were to up the quota of haddock and reduce the quota of cod, you could start levelling them out, potentially.
Here we are, reasons for change. In other words, why have the stocks fallen? Now, in 1880, most vessels were sail, powered by sail. So when you hauled in a net, you had your own body strength alone. There was no mechanical, motorised ability available to you. But around 1880, that started to be introduced and has been progressively introduced. So when you bring in motor engines into a ship, and you can have mechanical capstans, you are able to use much larger nets because you've got mechanical means to draw in the catch. So that's one reason. Next is that leads to the use of larger nets, which obviously means that you can catch more fish. You've also got increased days at sea because the means of staying at sea and the size of the ships and the general ability to stay at sea has improved. So fishing capacity expands for that. You've also got onboard refrigeration, so you don't immediately have to come back to port to land your fish, but you can store it. And if you see some of these programs on television, you'll see how they're refrigerated in ice. And very importantly, you've now got sonar, which enables a captain of a fishing vessel to very precisely locate where the stocks are in the sea, and thus deploy his nets to the greatest potential. So all of those are leading to increased fishing pressure. And really, in a sense, they're sort of irreversible trends. You would never want to undo any of those things. Small boat fishermen is being virtually eliminated. And it's large companies with large vessels deploying large nets that can stay out at sea for a very large period of time that are the operators, whereas back in 1880 it was a mass of small individual fish. And it's said, for example, that in the port of Lowestoft on the east coast, the harbour there was so full of small boats that you could actually walk from one side of the harbour to the other by just walking from one boat to the other. If you take the global situation, and this is the first page on your notes, these are I've given you there the figures from the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, which it produces an annual report on fisheries stocks. And that reveals that 7% of the world's stocks at the moment are being underfished. 60% are being fished to what would be regarded as their maximum sustainable yield. So if you go beyond that, then they will become overfished and the breeding stock would start to be damaged. And 33% are in fact being overfished at the present time. And if you go back to 1974, the figure of the stocks being overfished was 10%, whereas now it's 33%.
Where I would imagine that the increase in fishing pressure comes from largely unregulated fishing economies.
Yes,
So,
now what do you call unregulated fishing?
Like Asia probably, and India.
Yeah, the knowledge of these things, unregulated fishing is by definition...
Regulated but no sort of oversight.
Yeah, there's very little administration of the fisheries industry.
Yeah, so if it's happening in those areas, then surely the answer is, well, it's just to effectively regulate those fisheries.
Right, protect and regulate. So I'll put a very difficult question to you. How do you do that?
Well, I mean, to a large extent you can't, I suppose. But then, those countries had ought to probably start looking at regulating their fish in order to maintain their stocks. And it said in the video that you've got big Western trawler companies coming and trawling off their coasts. But are they fishing unsustainably? I mean, I'm sure they're not helping, but what is the source of the unsustainable fishing? Is that actually from these very small boats, or is it from the big super trawlers?
Well, it depends which part of the world you're talking about.
Like in Asia.
Yeah. Well, in Asia, I mean, the first thing to remember is that you've got a fisheries zone which goes out to 200 nautical miles, which is known as the exclusive economic zone, which belongs to the coastal country. So the sea bordering a coastal country has an exclusive economic zone where the fisheries are in the ownership, so to speak, of that country. Beyond that figure, out into the ocean, you've got what is known as the high seas, where there is no ownership. It's common ground. The stock is commonly owned by the world as a whole. And so you've got two different sets of circumstances. Now, if you take European fisheries, they're being managed out to the 200 nautical mile limit. Once you go beyond that, they're into the high seas and anyone can fish them. Now, in other parts of the world, if you want to keep other countries out of your exclusive economic zone, a lot depends on the capacity of your government to actually bring that into effect. And as we saw in the film Has Fish Had Its Chips, the EU, because it has overfished in our waters, has actually negotiated agreements with a lot of countries, particularly in West Africa at the present time, to go and fish their exclusive economic zone. So they've actually come in, formed trading fishing arrangements with those countries, and then bring them back, the fish caught back to Europe and sell into the European market. So it's a pretty complex state of affairs, which really has no governmental regulation in many parts of the seas. And this is one of the issues that has to be addressed, because otherwise fishing, overfishing, will go on, and the idea of being able to sustainably fish will be a dream, and that's the fear that underlines our film.
But where is most of this increase in unsustainable fisheries? What is it in Asia? Is that where the increase in unsustainable fishing is happening? You mentioned in the 70s it was 10% above maximum.
Well, if you go to the United Nations Food and Agricultural 2050 report, and you Google it, you can see their report from every sector of the ocean all around the world. And they provide an assessment of the degree to which the stocks in that part of the world are fished sustainably or otherwise. And I've cited for you at the bottom of that page an examples of the stocks that are overfished in the Mediterranean, the Southeast Pacific, and the Southwest Atlantic. And based on the 2015 figures, you've got 60% of the stocks in those parts of the world's oceans being overfished. Whereas in other parts of the Pacific, only 15% of the stocks are being overfished and fished. It's a very variable pattern. You don't want to be too categoric when you make these statements because it varies. The way cod is being fished at the moment, and you saw the impact that it's had on the North Sea stock, which 5 years had to be closed completely because it was on the brink of extinction. And so they had to take drastic measures under the Common Fisheries Policy, and there was no fishing of that stock for 3 or 4 years, I think it was. What had been going on there, and still goes on even now, is the method of fishing. And that is primarily related to the size of the net that they use. For a fish stock to rebound, it's got to be able to reproduce successfully. As same with any species, it's almost too obvious to state, but it's true, it's the fundamental point. And a cod can live to the age of about 25, in which case you end up with a very, very large fish. And sometimes you see photographs of cod that are that size. Now, cod becomes sexually mature at around the age of 3. And will start, if you take the female, it will start laying eggs at that age, and it will lay, in a year, about 250,000 eggs. Now, every time a cod increases its weight by around 1 kilogram, so it doubles, basically, its ability to produce eggs. Which means that the older the cod that you have in your stock, the more fecund, in terms of its ability to produce eggs, is that fish. So what you need in a stock is older fish, because they are the ones producing the most eggs, and therefore maximising the reproductive potential of that stock. And if you take a cod of around the age of 8 years, compared to one of 3 years, which is producing 250,000 eggs, an 8-year-old is producing about 2.5 million eggs. And that increase will go on as the fish grows older and older. So in order to rebuild those stocks that we saw, you've got to have older fish in the stock. Now, out of 1 million eggs that are laid each year, only 2 need to survive to adulthood for that stock to be able to reproduce successfully. So all the remaining 999,000 eggs are food within the marine food ecosystem, the food chain. So they too are actually serving a very vital purpose to other creatures. So having a large stock of fish is beneficial in that sense as well. Now, what happens with the nets is that they are of a size that once a cod reaches 5 years of age, it's too big to get through the net. So any fish, any codfish that is older than 5 years, which happens to be trapped in a net, is pulled out of the sea. And when you repeat that year after year, as they have been doing, you end up with a breeding stock where the oldest adult in that stock is just 5 years old. And all the potential and older fish are eliminated from that stock. And so its capacity to reproduce is suppressed. And so net size is absolutely fundamental in terms of how you manage a fishery. And the same principle applies to other species of fish and the way they're fished. So if you want to increase the spawning stock, you've actually got to increase the mesh size of that net. And that is one of the primary reforms that needs to take place. And you say to yourself, right, we're going to let fish, cod in this instance, get through the net until it's the age of 8, 10, whatever figure you want to set. And that way you actually end up rebuilding the stock. The difficulty in that, and it's not happened, it didn't happen in the Commons Fisheries Reform, is that you end up having to effectively closing that fishery for 5 years. So if you set the net size at 8 years and they're catching them at 3, you're closing it for 3 years. If you're setting it at 10, you're closing it for 5 years. So the fishing industry takes a hit. It's unable to catch that particular species for that period of time. And that would happen then on the expectation of a reinvigorated industry once you reopen it. But at the present time, that kind of thinking, no one has been prepared to bite that kind of bullet. And that kind of reform is still off the table. But it's where we have to go if we are to get the fish stocks back to anything near historic levels. Fish, as you will appreciate, are a key dimension of the whole marine ecosystem. And so having abundant stocks is absolutely essential for other creatures. They simply can't survive.
Is it possible to, is there any work that shows that it's possible to easily bring these numbers back up to pre-levels, or has something else moved into the area that takes up the niche, basically, the perfect niche that they want fish, like the cod wants?
Can I say something to that? It's really interesting with whaling, actually, because obviously whaling is a fraction of what it used to be. But what they found is actually, because whaling is far less than it was, lots of whale stocks which aren't impacted by other environmental factors that are actually impacted by whaling have recovered quite well. But actually the sort of global whale population makeup is really different to what it was pre-whaling times, because things have moved and changed like that. So although you have got quite good recovery, not of all whale stocks, some whale stocks are kind of depleted beyond the point of no return, but a lot of others have recovered, but not in the same makeup. So I guess that is kind of an example of that. I don't know whether there's other fish ones.
Yes, there is. I mean, there's 2 points. Just to take up the whale one, for example. If you go to the Southern Ocean, i.e. around Antarctica, the principal food source there, particularly for whales, but for the other larger animals around there, is krill, which is this tiny shrimp-like creature, which is being heavily fished. Heavily is a bit of a emotive term, which I asked not to use, but it is licensed. It's controlled by the authority that regulates it, so it's a licensed fishery. But it's removing out of the food chain the essential resource, food, of whales. So you've got to be very careful about that. But to go back to fish, if you go to the Newfoundland cod fishery, which used to be the world's largest cod fishery, massive, dwarfed the North Sea and anywhere like that completely. They went on fishing that, despite scientific advice that they should stop at the fishing at the levels they were. They went on fishing it till the point where the whole stock collapsed. It went over the edge. So this safe biological limit, what is a safe breeding stock, was breached and the stock collapsed. Now what that meant was that when you've got just 2 cod out of every million surviving, that was still the case, but the breeding stock was so small that it couldn't produce enough young fish to regenerate the stock. Because although some of the eggs were hatching and becoming fertile and becoming young juveniles, they were being eaten by other fish because the sea is a carnivorous world. So they weren't getting that 2 out of every million survival because other fish were eating them, and the breeding stock was insufficient to get above that threshold. And that stock, the Newfoundland stock, has been obliterated ever since. And you've gone into a whole ecological alteration as to the nature of the fishery of that coast of North America. And that stock's not been able to come back because you breach the ecological terms under which it operates. And that was what the grave danger that was going to happen with the North Sea stock. They were breaching the safe biological limit, and that's why they closed it. It's fortunately sufficiently in time to allow it to rebuild, but it's still at this very depressed level, which will never rise anywhere near historic terms until you address fundamental things like net size, the days at sea that fishermen have. And the key thing you have to address is where fishermen actually do their fishing. Now, what would be anyone's suggestion as to where fishermen would go to actually do their fishing? What if you were in charge of a vessel, you were the captain, you had to make a profit on that voyage, and you were going for whatever species it is, where would be your primary geographic location to go for? What is determining that? Sonar is one, yeah, that's telling you where it is, but why are the fish there where they are? Yeah, what elaborate? Spawning grounds, exactly. Now, cod are a migratory fish, but they come together at a specific location every year, they aggregate and all come together as one stock when they spawn. And that is what is being targeted by fishing vessels using the fishing system that's allowed at the moment. So using the large nets, using the large vessels, they are able to really reap a very heavy toll, so to speak, in ecological terms, on that fishery. So one of the other things that you have to consider when you put restrictions on fisheries is that you do not fish the spawning grounds. You put those out of limits. And so there's a whole complex network of measures that you can take. I don't want to spend too much longer on this, and you'll find other facts in the notes that I've given you, because I want to move on to two other things before we finish, because I know you've got some films which I'd like to show as well, and I'm conscious of where we are against the clock. Now, one of the other factors that is affecting fish stocks, but the general health of the oceans as a whole, and this question of what will the conditions of the oceans be in 2050, is the question raised earlier on, acidification. And so I want to look at that one, because that's very important. And also related to that is pollution in a general sense. And then the other question I want to look at before we finish is marine protected areas, i.e. strategies for closing or protecting areas so that you've got management policies of human activity which give the sea a greater chance of being in a healthy condition. Now, if we take acidification, the first one, I think there is a slide on that. We've got that, and this is basically a shortened version of your notes. There's two things to consider. Before we actually consider the acidification, what is the substance in chemical terms that we're dealing with here? What is it that's causing acidification?
Yes, CO2.
CO2, yes, carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide is having two effects on the ocean. One is acidification, which I'll come to in a second, but the other is actual warming of the ocean. Now, the ocean is absorbing the excess heat that carbon dioxide is creating. You're probably completely familiar with global warming and how carbon dioxide acts as a greenhouse gas. And we're pumping out whatever million tons of carbon dioxide globally a year. And that has a thermal effect. But most of that heat, 90% of that heat that has been generated over the decades, has been absorbed by the ocean. The ocean has become a sink for all that excess heat. If it hadn't been a sink, then the actual atmospheric temperature that we are living in would have risen by 36 degrees centigrade. 60, I think it's 65 or something degrees Fahrenheit, above what it is the average today. In other words, we would have frazzled. We wouldn't be living here now. And the only reason we are is because all of that excess energy that we've been releasing into the atmosphere through burning fossil fuels has been sinking into the ocean. So the ocean is serving, in planetary terms, as a huge regulator of the consequences of the way we're living at the moment. Nevertheless, the sea is actually warming as a result. I mean, the sea, the oceans, cover 72 or whatever percent it is of the planet to enormous depths. So the body of water that you're talking about is absolutely mind-bogglingly big, that it's too big to quantify. So as a sink, it's capable of doing this. But nevertheless, it's warmed by 1 degree centigrade. And if this goes on, that's when I say this, the carbon dioxide story, then we're going to continue to increase global temperatures. And that warming the ocean has an effect on marine life. Now, if we come to the acidification question, again it's carbon dioxide going into the sea, and here it forms carbonic acid. Now, the seas are naturally alkaline. So when we use this term acidification, what we're actually meaning is we're reducing the alkalinity of the ocean. And the alkalinity of the ocean at the moment is, I think it's 8.1 pH on the scale that they use. Neutral is 7. If you're above neutral, you're alkaline. If you're above 7, you're alkaline. If you're below 7, you're acidic. Now, what's happened by absorbing this carbon dioxide, we've reduced the pH value by 0.1, which doesn't sound much, but it's a logarithmic scale, and it has consequences. And if we go on with the fossil fuel manner of living, then it's predicted that the pH value will fall by 0.3, possibly 0.5 by the end of this century. Now, what is the consequence of reducing the alkalinity of the ocean, turning it more acidic?
Bleaching.
Go on. Sorry, who's that? Someone saying bleaching?
Resulting bleaching, crustaceans or...
When you say bleaching, can you elaborate a bit?
So,
Pardon?
like more acidic water will affect like corals and invertebrates, which are like low food chain.
Yeah, it will affect them. How? What's it doing? What's actually physiologically happening? Dissolving the calcium, yes, which forms the bones, our bones, their bones. And whether you've got an exoskeleton, i.e. the shell, that's an exoskeleton, or an internal skeleton, as in fish, that's all made of calcium. And so when you reduce the alkalinity of the ocean, you reduce the ability of marine organisms to take up calcium out of the ocean, i.e. they get osteoporosis. Their bone structure deteriorates, and if the alkalinity continues to decline, it collapses. Now, as you'll appreciate, there are the overwhelming majority of creatures of whatever kind in the ocean are relying on calcium take-up to keep themselves alive. And it even goes down to the smallest micro creatures in the sea. The zooplankton and the phytoplankton, even the plants, have calcareous shells. So increased acidification, reduction of alkalinity, threatens to cause a physiological illness throughout the whole planetary marine ecosystem. And if we're talking in terms of the collapse, which was being prophesied in our film, that is probably of equal, if not more importance, than overfishing. Because if you physiologically cannot form the basic structure of your body, then that is as disastrous as the fact of not being able to breed. And so the question of how we, as a global society, address this carbon dioxide issue is of fundamental importance. So it's not just, you need to see the dimension of how it runs into the ocean. And when it affects corals, which was mentioned here, which leads to coral bleaching, that means the corals are actually dying. Now, corals are particularly important because although they only occupy about 1% of the ocean floor space, they are actually vital in terms of habitat structure for supporting marine species. And it's estimated, I think it was I got the figure from the WWF, about 25% of fish and other marine species. So if coral collapse, then you've got a very serious change going in. And coral collapses not just because of loss of calcium, but also because it's only able to live in a very narrow temperature band. So the rising in the temperature of the ocean is equally critical to coral. Fish in the North Sea, which cod, for example, likes to live doesn't like to live in temperatures that go much above what they are at the moment, and we've noticed that they're migrating northwards as the temperature is rising. They will move into cooler waters. They're able to actually relocate. But things like corals, that's not practical. So that's a further dimension there. And we've also got, whilst we're looking at pollution, you've got the plastics question, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. The facts are very clear that when you go to the centre of the circulatory motion of the currents in the various oceans, what known as the gyres, you will find this large concentration of plastic. And it's estimated about 8 million tonnes of plastic is being put into the ocean every year. I don't know whether that figure's all right or not, but even if it's got a substantial margin of error, you can appreciate the vast size. Now, one of the interesting figures that I saw only yesterday, actually, in reading the newspaper, was that of that 8 million that's going into the sea, 700,000 tonnes is fish nets. So when you've got these large fishing vessels operating in the high seas, deploying nets, which for one reason or another they lose, they are being lost and not recovered. That has, the consequence of forming, as you can see, about 1/10 of all the plastic that's being added to the ocean each year. And because of the nature of the net, it traps a lot of other marine creatures in them who drown as a consequence or are unable to escape and starve or asphyxiate. So there's that dimension to it as well. There are various estimates that if we go on using and releasing plastic in the same way as we are at the moment, the weight of plastic in the ocean by 2050 will be equal to the weight of all the fish in the ocean. I don't quite know how that calculation's been made. Presumably, you can weigh the plastic up on one hand and estimate the weight of the fish stocks on the other, but that prediction has been made. It's illustrative, I think, rather than factual, of the trend in which we're going. So we have to think also as a society globally as to what is causing that. And then you've got other issues of pollution besides, and I haven't got time really to go into a great deal of those, but one of them in our seas that has a great deal of impact is marine aggregate dredging, which I have to bring to your attention because it's one of the areas where Marinet does a lot of work. One of the problems in this country is where do you source the sand and gravel that you use for the construction industry, which is one of the basic ingredients of making concrete. And either you've got to go to a land-based quarry, or you've got to actually produce the gravel and break up the rock. Now, many people don't like quarries near them, so the industry has been allowed by government to go offshore and to actually hoover up the seabed. Now, gravel beds are prime habitat for fish. That's where fish like to spawn. And so dredging a gravel bed has very serious consequences in terms of impact on marine life. And if you take London, for example, virtually 100% of the sand and gravel that is being used by the construction industry to build in London today is coming from the seabed around the UK. In the English Channel, off the Thames estuary, and along the East Anglian coast. So it's a major industry with a major impact, and Marinet has been focusing on that, particularly most recently in the case of the Goodwin Sands, which lie just after Dover, because the Dover Harbour Board has wanted to dredge the Goodwin Sands for sand in a port redevelopment scheme. And that's a potential marine conservation zone for a number of different reasons. But nevertheless, the licensing agency, the Marine Management Organisation, part of government, has just given a licence to dredge the Goodwin Sands. And the one other fact that I draws your attention, is another report that was in the paper yesterday. Fukushima. Fukushima is. Pardon?
Well, nuclear reactor.
Yeah, the nuclear reactor in Japan that got destroyed by the tsunami when they had an earthquake offshore. Just when I say nuclear reactor, they actually had 3 or 4 nuclear vessels there. Now, one of the problems there is that nuclear power stations, I don't know whether you know much about them, but nuclear power stations require cooling water constantly to stop them exploding. And if you don't cool them down, they do explode, which is what happened at Fukushima, because the tidal wave came, blew all the electricity, pumps failed, and the whole thing blew up. Now, in order to keep the remnants of Fukushima under control, they've had to artificially control, to irrigate the remaining reactors and the radioactive material that's there. And they've been storing that in large tanks on site in the hope that the cleaning up technology that they use at a place like Sellafield, up on the Cumbrian coast, can remove the radioactive material out of the water and thus allow them to discharge that cooling water into the sea. But it turns out that the technology that they've been using hasn't worked. And so they've left with all their tank capacity is now virtually full up. And the radioactive contamination, strontium, iodine, radionuclides in particular, is still present. And they are confronted by the problem, what do we do with this water? And they're currently seeking permission from the government to discharge it into the ocean. So you've got pressures, which is just, that's one example of pollution going on all around. And these are the things that we, as a civilization, as a global civilization, have got to address if the health of the oceans is going to be maintained and we don't end up in that 2050 scenario. Now, the last thing I want to just bring to your attention is these marine protected areas. What kind of management would actually be deployed if you were a manager of a marine protected area? What would you say to yourself? What are my objectives here? How do I go about this? What am I actually managing?
So you're managing the things that could be detrimental to the environment. So if it's the specific protected area, you're you'd have no fishing, you would have no harvesting of anything from the area, clean environment, have it cleaned frequently, minimal pollutants, so of course, inevitably we're always going to have pollutants from everywhere, and you know, just helping promote the area or the ecosystem of its required nutrients and enabling them to stay secure.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Help the ecosystem. Now, you've given us a suggestion, and this is putting my sort of finger on this precise point, which may seem a bit obscure to you, but the point I'm trying to make is that you cannot manage the oceans. They're the natural world, full of many species, most of which we've absolutely no clue about, let alone knowing how they breathe and sustain themselves. So you can't manage the natural world. So when you create a marine protected area, it's not the natural world that you're managing. It's the human activity and its impact on the natural world that you are managing. And that's the vital distinction in what a marine protected area is doing. Managing the human activity so that what we do does not damage the integrity of that ecosystem, of the natural world. So you have an idea of the principles of the way in which that ecosystem operates, which will be imperfect because our knowledge is limited, but it's the actual human activity that marine protected areas have to concentrate on. Now, the difficulty with marine protected areas is the management regime of human activity that is set up. And when you study the subject, you'll find that the term marine protected area varies in whichever part of the world, which countries made it, and it's a very broad definition altogether as to what constitutes it. But the idea of conservation is the primary one. But as you can see, even in the United Kingdom, where we've set up our own version of the marine conservation zones, we are allowing human activity inside a marine conservation zone, such as Goodwin Sands, which is going to be damaging to the integrity of that ecosystem. So we've set up a management concept of, which in many ways you might describe as feeble. There is no actual management body. There is no group of people who come together regularly to discuss how to manage the human activity. The best you get is licensing it. And that's it. And even when they've got a licensing control, it's still allowing things to happen which impact on it. And you'll find that there's 50-odd marine conservation zones around the country, and it would be an interesting project if you had time to do it, to see what kind of human activity is actually allowed in our own, in the UK, marine conservation zones. And one of them is fishing. Most marine conservation zones are fished. Most marine conservation zones will get an aggregate dredging license if it's applied for. And then you've got all the other polluting effects that we're only just beginning to touch upon in the discussion. So marine protected areas is the direction that we've got to travel. And the concluding idea that I'm going to leave you before we look at the films is that one of the pieces of work being done by a Marinet member, which is called Conserving the Great Blue, is to set up at a global level a management system of human activity, a licensed management activity that covers the whole spectrum of human activity. Now that may seem a highly utopian, idealistic attempt, and it is. But we do believe that the 2050 scenario that we've made the film about is a very real danger. And the only way we can guarantee avoiding it is to set up a management system of the way in which we use the ocean, which is 100% responsible. We've got a climate treaty in the Montreal Protocol, which deals with the substances that destroy ozone in the atmosphere. And you may recall, I don't know whether you had it in your lectures, but the ozone problem. Now, the Montreal Protocol has managed to get a grip on that, and that's a global treaty on what is allowed to be emitted into the atmosphere. We've got a struggling global effort to control carbon dioxide that's going on at the moment, which doesn't look as though it's going to cut the mustard. We need to also have a strategy for managing the oceans and a further pillar in this global management of the way in which we live on this planet. And that's where we, Marinet, are focused, bringing in the pillar into this management affecting the oceans. And that's one of our primary objectives at the present time, and we're working on that at the moment. So we'll go into your films, I think.
Before we go into your films, I just thank you very much.